Good morning and welcome to Face the Nation. I'm Margaret Brennan. We begin today with two congressional Republicans from South Carolina, Senator Tim Scott and Representative Trey Gowdy. Their new book, Unified, tells the story of their close friendship and their hope to heal a divided country. Welcome to both of you, gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to
You
be
don't
with
hear the word unified very often in Washington these days.
Unfortunately, we're living in a polarized country, but I think there's a chance that we can be one nation if we focus on the things that we have in common.
I want to talk to you both about why you wrote this book, why you did it together, but I want to also ask you about some of the news of the moment. Congressman Gowdy, President Trump has fired the Veterans Affairs Secretary. One of the things that has come to light are questions about some of his spending habits and an IG report questioning a trip to Europe. You're on House oversight. Was there anything improper here?
Improper from the standpoint of violating policies and procedures, or just not a good stewardship of tax dollars? I kind of view
the
them
secretary
differently.
says this was unfair criticism of him.
You know what? I think being in public service is a sacred trust, and you shouldn't spend other people's money any differently from how you would spend your own. And I think it was a good idea that he decided to leave. I think the questions are better than his answers in this fact pattern, and the president was right to either replace him, or Dr. Shulkin was right to leave.
I also want to ask you, both of you gentlemen, about the Russia probe. The special counsel did reveal this week that Trump campaign official Rick Gates, who is a cooperating witness in that investigation, knowingly had communications on more than one occasion during the campaign with a person the FBI believes had active ties to Russian intelligence. Congressman, as a former prosecutor, what does this say to you?
It says that I'm glad we have Bob Mueller. I'm glad we have an independent ball and strike caller. Congress has proven itself incapable of conducting serious investigations. And our best hope
You
for finding
include your own committee, House Intelligence, on that?
Absolutely. Not just House Intelligence. Congressional investigations leak like the Gossip Girls. They're terrible, and I would be telling you that if I were staying in Congress. They're just not serious. Serious investigations don't leak. Serious investigations don't make up their mind first and then go in search of the evidence to validate your previously held conviction.
Did your committee do that with clearing any collusion in the case of Russia?
I think Adam Schiff in March of 2017 said he had evidence more than circumstantial but not direct. And oh, by the way, there is no body of evidence that's more than circumstantial but not direct. But he said he had it of collusion. And we've been waiting for over a month, for over a year now, for him to actually produce that evidence. So yeah, he started with the conclusion, and then he went in search of the evidence, and he hasn't found it yet. That is not serious, and I'm hoping that either the Senate investigation or Mueller will be more objective.
Senator, the person tied to Russian intelligence that we're talking about did work with Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort. You've been on record in the past saying that President Trump should not pardon Michael Flynn. Do you view Paul Manafort differently?
I do not. I think it's important that the White House be clear on this position as it relates to not treating either person differently. The fact of the matter is, keeping the pardon off the table is a necessary part of the process. I would be disappointed if President Trump were to pardon either one of these individuals. The good news is that the Mueller investigation continues. The better news is that the public will have as much information as necessary to draw clear conclusions. And today, it only reinforces why it's important for us to make sure that the investigation continues until it gets to the end. I hope that we get there sooner than later, but the reality of it is that the more information we find out, the better, and the more confident the American people will be in who we are as a nation.
Does that mean you would support legislation to protect Bob Mueller from being fired?
So far, so good. We don't need the legislation. I've been asked that question a couple times. I don't know that we need legislation to move forward. I don't know that there's a single senator that would come out in favor of stopping the investigation from going forward.
Congressman Gowdy, the DOJ Inspector General has come out and decided to launch a probe into some of the things that you had raised concerns about in terms of the FISA process. Is this probe sufficient to match your concerns?
I have tremendous confidence in Michael Horowitz. He's a fantastic former prosecutor, and he's exactly what you want in an inspector general. I still think you need special counsel, because I think there are witnesses that that Mr. Horowitz would not have access to that are outside the Department of Justice.
You want this a step farther than where he's going right now?
Well, in particular, let's assume he finds criminality. I don't assume criminality, but for the sake of this fact pattern, he finds it. Who's he going to take his facts to? I don't think he can take it to the Department of Justice. So you're going to need special counsel at some point. I would just assume Mr. Sessions do that now. Horowitz is a great guy to investigate. He can't prosecute, and I'm still concerned that he won't have access to all the witnesses.
Senator, you are on the Armed Services Committee. I want to ask you a bit about what we've heard from the president. He's been floating this idea of asking to use Pentagon funding to pay for this border wall. Is that lawful?
Well, certainly I think it would take an act of Congress to make sure that we prioritize and appropriate the dollars for that objective. The reality of it is, as Commander-in-Chief, he can certainly send signals through Secretary Mattis to have a conversation with Congress about where those dollars should be spent. Good news is we're providing more money to the military than we have in a very long time, more than a decade. The unfortunate reality is that the priorities of the DOD have already been set. It's important for us to make sure that we continue to do things like provide our men and women in uniform with a raise, 2.4% this last budget cycle. They need more. The number of challenges that we have around the world seem to be endless at some point. However, our southern border is very porous. The truth is that more folks came through our southern border that did not come from Mexico. So it is certainly a national security issue. I think Homeland so far is the place that we should find the resources for building the wall, not necessarily the DOD, but I'll see what comes to before my committee to make sure that we have enough information to make a decision.
You're saying Congress would need to weigh in to reprogram those funds. That's not something
Absolutely.
through executive authority you should direct.
We should not expect that from the president. We should expect him to make his recommendation that will flow through Secretary Mattis, come before both the HASC and the SASC, and then we'll make a decision on the prioritization of the funds.
I want to ask you both about this book you wrote together.
Yes.
Why did you write this?
I think he has a compelling life narrative. I find it inspirational from the moment we became friends. I think the story of how he got where he is a story of hope that our whole country would benefit from. I think contrast is good. I think conflict is debilitating. I think we're in a dangerous time in our history in terms of political discourse. I think most Americans want most of the same things out of life. Yeah. We just have a tendency to focus on the things that we don't agree on as opposed to those that we do. But I think there's a hunger and a yearning for unity, and if you can find it with a handsome bald-headed guy from Charleston and a middle-aged son of a doctor from the upstate of South Carolina, then I think everyone can benefit from unlikely friendships.
Why is it an unlikely friendship, Senator?
Well, we were raised very differently. We have different perspectives. While we're both Republicans, the reality of it is we come down very differently on a lot of the issues. I think about an affluent fellow from a doctor's house, a poor kid, single-parent household. I think about the challenges of race in our state. We have a very provocative history on race in South Carolina. And the truth is that after the 2015 Mother Emanuel Church shooting, I found myself turning to a white guy in the aftermath. It became clear to me that there is a chance to bridge real gaps in this country. And if that was an example of one real bridging of a gap after a racially motivated shooting in Charleston, South Carolina led me to turn to a white guy that I did not know before I came to Congress, are there lessons within this friendship that can help our nation that seems to be so polarized, in such conflict, mired in challenges, and sometimes heading towards tribalism? If there's a way to bridge that gap, can we and should we tell that story? I think we can, and I think we should, and we did. And that's why Unified is such an important project for me, because it's a part of my personal mission of being a bridge builder. Our nation needs to see more unity. And to the extent that we, coming from very different paths, very different positions on issues, it's important for this nation to see reasons to be hopeful coming from Washington and frankly from each of our houses.
Why was Congressman Gowdy your first phone call? A white guy, as you put it.
Yeah, well, I think it was the credibility that we had built over the 4 or 5 years that preceded the shooting. When I came to Congress, I knew of him but didn't know him at all. Over time, I realized that I could put confidence in what he said. There was rapport, there was credibility, and we had issues that we saw differently. And we came to the table because we had the credibility to have a conversation, which led us to solving problems together. I hope our nation does that.
What did you think when you got that phone call that night of the shooting in Charleston?
Just what Tim said, we have a provocative history in our state when it comes to race. My first thought was a spiritual thought. God, how can you let 9 people be murdered when all they wanted to do was go learn about you? And then what it would mean to a black man to know that they were murdered simply because of the color of their skin. Just kind of a, oh Lord, let's don't go here again in South Carolina. And the beautiful part was his intention was to start a race war in our state, and it had exactly the opposite effect.
I want to talk about all of this when we come back, because I know this was such a turning point, not just in your friendship, but what you're asking people to do in this book and what your message is. But we got to take a quick pause in the conversation. We'll be right back in a moment. We're back now for more with Senator Tim Scott and Congressman Trey Gowdy to talk about their new book, Unified. You've talked a lot about the incident in Charleston and that really sort of inspiring you to sit down and issue this call for action. What are you asking the public for in this book?
I think if you look at the polarization that exists in this country, we have to find a path back to being one nation. I found that path through a horrific church shooting that provided me a chance to reflect on progress and pain. My family, I think of my grandfather who passed away in 2016. He was unable to drink from the same water fountain for the vast majority of his life, unable to go to a restaurant, unable to walk on the same sidewalk, could not finish school beyond the 3rd grade. And for me to live out a part of his American dream, to be able to converse and to challenge other folks, and then in the aftermath of a church shooting, think about all that history in my family, to turn to Trey, was just such a symbol of progress that I believe that all things are possible in this great nation if we find ourselves as a part of the same American family. And I found that with Trey. And I hope that as we look around this country with more police shootings, with more division, more tribalism, that we all look for the things that we have in common to solve our problems. I think it's perhaps one of the greatest national security issues we have in this country. That if we allow the polarization to continue in this country, those outside of this country that want to bring harm will feast on the division in this country and create more polarization. The Russians did that during the 2016 election. They focused on the opportunity to sow seeds of discord that only leads to an erosion of our foundation and makes us quite more vulnerable.
In America right now, I mean, what do you think is the catalyst for that? Do you think that President Trump and his administration have deepened this divide? Have you seen any signs of hope that they're helping to bridge it?
I will say that when I went to the president after the Charlottesville shooting, after the Charlottesville after the Charlottesville incident, he asked me, what could he do? We were not on the same page as it relates to the history of race in this nation, but we found a common position on legislative remedies that could help people in distressed communities. The opportunity zones that we're talking about throughout this country, the president said he would commit to supporting that legislation. He did, it's now law, and now 50 million Americans may see reasons to breathe hopefully about the future because of that legislation that will bring more resources into distressed communities. So there's a number of ways for us to do that. But it's going to not come simply from the White House. It has to come from each of our houses. That we're going to have to recognize that we're a part of the same American family, that the fabric of this nation requires us in this melting pot to come together when there are differences and to challenge each other, but not to challenge our intentions, perhaps to challenge our positions.
After Charlottesville, you said the president is not a racist, but he is racially insensitive.
Yes.
Is that still what you believe?
Absolutely. Yeah, the president is not a racist, but is he racially insensitive? I think the answer is yes.
You haven't seen an improvement in language or in actions by the Justice Department?
Well, I can't say whether or not the entire administration reflects his position. I will say that he has been very positive on legislative remedies. I think if you follow the facts, what you'll find is that unemployment rates within the African American community at 6.9% haven't been this low in almost 2 decades. The Hispanic community hasn't been this low in almost 2 decades. The fact is that the policy position of the administration is moving this country in the right direction economically. We still have to work on the tone and the rhetoric. That is a passion that I have. Bridging the gap isn't simply having policy positions. It's actually making sure that we're inclusive in our conversations, inclusive in our language. We can get there, but I'm not going to expect one person to lead us there. This country's always been a ground up country. We need to remain that country.
Congressman, you in the book also talk about how in your communities you've tried to bring people together. As a former prosecutor, you say your gut often is to be sympathetic to law enforcement, but because of your friendship and these conversations, you've seen sort of an evolution in how you view incidents. I want to ask you about this shooting. Once again, we are seeing protests about the shooting of an unarmed black man and questions being raised about excessive force in the case of Stephon Clark. And this question at the White House was responded to with the answer, this is a local matter. Do you think that these conversations need to be had at the federal level? Do you wish that they were, or is that not appropriate?
No, it's a national conversation. I actually took the local matter to be, maybe it's because I'm a prosecutor, that it's a state crime. It's a local law enforcement matter from a criminal justice standpoint, but it's a national conversation. Tim knows my bias, I'll put that word in quotes, is towards law enforcement, as you would expect a prosecutor's to be. I am not oblivious to the fact that there are bad police officers, just like they're bad everything else. He has helped me remarkably. Not just him, but also other people of color in my life have helped me understand every interaction I've had with the police is because I was speeding. I should have had an interaction with them. I don't wear a pin. I've never been stopped by Capitol Police, and I don't wear a member pin. He's been stopped wearing a member pin. So I am naive to believe that my life experience covers everyone. I need to hear, you ask why we wrote the book, we have to hear from people with different perspectives. You have to have a relationship with someone with a different perspective. I have no idea what he sees when he sees blue lights. And I think he's benefited, well, I know he has. He calls the widows of fallen police officers before I call them in South Carolina. So he gets the danger side of it, but he's also a black man who's had a very different relationship with law enforcement than I have. So you ask, why write the book? So we can talk to one another, find the things we have in common instead of racing to the conflict, which is commercially successful, and you get a lot of clicks. It's just destroying our country.
In Unified, one of the things you'll find is that Trey put his money where he put it where it matters the most. We held roundtable discussions with law enforcement and African American ministers and community leaders, because after our relationship continued to evolve, we understood the importance of bringing more people into the room so that we could solve some problems before they happened. I call that part of the aftermath mentality, finding a way for us to bridge the gap before there's a chasm. I'm hopeful that as we look at the situations around this country, people can learn from bringing very different communities together, and it has been impactful.
It was a choice for you to finally speak out on issues of race. In fact, you talk about in the book that it was something you consciously decided you didn't want to be, as the Congressman referred to you, the unicorn and treated as a novelty in some ways. And it stood out to me, the bit of advice you say that Congressman Gowdy gave you, that don't let other people use your political capital unless you decide you want to. So for you to sit and talk and write about race, for you to speak out, it's something that has really changed for you.
It has. I've spent 20 years in elective office, maybe a little more than that now, and I have not been a fellow who's focused on race that much. In the last 4 or 5 years, I've been compelled to do so because the circumstances requires a response. And as the highest ranking African American in politics today, that response lays on my shoulders. And so one of the things that you hear about in Unified is this struggle to make sure that I represent all of my constituents and not simply take the easy way out. And a part of that requires me to speak up and speak out about my personal experiences. And I talk about being stopped 7 times in 1 year. I talk about, Trey talks about putting together the round table discussions with law enforcement and people of color. It is important for us to show not only that there is a division. Our country is very good at pointing out the division. We're not necessarily as focused on solutions to that division, because the division sells. As Trey said, the conflict sells. What's important to me is, yes, there is conflict, but can we move the conflict to a position of contrast so that we solve the problems? The roundtable discussions that we had in South Carolina helped move the ball forward. I'm excited about the book because I'm excited about the mission of building a bridge so that we are, in fact, one nation focused on the same problems, and I think the book Unified helps us get there.
One of the most heated issues at the moment is gun control. Do either of you think there'll be any action on gun safety before the midterm elections?
Before the midterm, I don't know. I think that's a wonderful issue upon which for us to prove there are areas of consensus, provided the two sides come with a relationship and don't judge one another's motives. We're both friends with Marco Rubio. It took a lot of courage for him to show up at that town hall. I think most political advisors would have told him not to.
To speak to the Stoneman Douglas students in the wake of the shooting.
And to then be confronted, by seeing you as like looking down the barrel of an assault weapon. I don't know how that is calculated towards getting us towards a place of comedy with a T. And consensus on gun control. I think there is room for consensus on the gun show loophole, on NICS, on making sure the information gets in. There may be consensus on magazine capacity and the weaponry. We'll never know because
those are the things the students are asking for, and you met with some of those students.
I did. I had the privilege of meeting with several of the students from the high school. Both those who are in favor of more gun control and the one student who is opposed to that. The reality of it is in the last spending bill, we had fixed NICS as a part of that. So we have done something about bringing together those folks who find common ground on dealing with some of the gun violence in this nation. The gun show loophole, that is what led to Dylan Roof having the weapon in Charleston, South Carolina, was a part of what I believe was fixed by the fixed NICS legislation that was included in the spending bill. The focus on mental illness as the most pervasive factor in all the mass shootings in the last few years, the mental component cannot be denied. The mental health component cannot be denied. So we've done things that will help us in Sutherland Springs, where I think it was 26 parishioners lost their lives because the information was not loaded into the NICS system. There's been some steps that we've taken. There's still more steps to be taken, but we are actually moving forward in a very positive and constructive way. I think the DOJ talked about banning bump stocks. That legislation would fly through Congress tomorrow. So there is a path forward, and we should take those incremental steps as they are available and continue the conversation.
Congressman Gowdy, I've got to be honest, a lot of people in Washington, when they hear that you are issuing a call for unity, will say he's been associated with two of the most divisive, politically heated probes in Washington. The probe into what happened in Benghazi and the most recent House intelligence probe into Russian election meddling. How do you reconcile those things?
I hear about the divisiveness. I just don't hear about it from my colleagues. I hear about it a lot from people in your line of work, how divisive I am, and yet I don't have a fractured relationship with a single solitary Democrat that serves in the House. So conflict sells. It is much more commercially appealable to refer to something as hyperpartisan or deeply divisive. The reality is, with respect to Benghazi, I did everything I could to handle that like a normal investigation. I was not hyper-focused on Secretary Clinton. Lots of other people were, including people with respect in your line of work. It's not interesting enough to simply find out how our folks were rescued from the annex. If it didn't involve her, folks weren't interested in it. So out of 100 witnesses, 1 was named Clinton, and out of all the hearings we had, 0 were about her email. But yet, that's the narrative that's imprinted. And it's one reason I can't wait to be out of politics, frankly, where the jury is a little more open-minded. They haven't made up their minds yet. Facts matter. And there's a referee that can say, you know what, there's no evidentiary support for that whatsoever. In politics, you can say it and get away with it.
Well, you do talk in the book, though, about the Benghazi investigation being personally difficult.
It was terrible.
You actually, Senator, described it as probably the loneliest extended session of his life.
Let me just weigh in here very quickly. Whether it's Russia or the Benghazi investigation, the one thing that Trey tried to do in both situations was go after the truth, not after Hillary Clinton, and Republicans were unhappy with that. He went after the truth. Democrats were unhappy because Hillary Clinton was attached to the conversation, and she had no choice but to be attached to it. It happened on her watch. But on the Russia situation, the fact of the matter is, if you've listened to Trey Gowdy talk about how poorly the president's lawyer represented his position, there's no question that if you're looking for a way to be partisan on the issue, you don't make those comments.
You're referring there to John Depp.
If you're looking for the truth, yes, if you're looking for the truth, then you go where it leads. And there's no doubt that if you look at the actual evidence on both of those situations, it is clear that Trey Gowdy was looking for the truth. And one of the reasons why I talk about that in the book, the Benghazi story, is because to watch the weight of the investigation on his face and on his shoulders, and frankly on that hair that is now whiter than snow, it is because he did not want to be a partisan. His objective was to be a prosecutor looking for the truth and then present the evidence to the American people and let that jury decide.
In reading this book, it's clear the affection you have for each other. And Congressman Gowdy, you seem very supportive of the senator and him staying in Washington, though you say you're going back home. People are going to ask the question of whether you are going to make a run for office. I know you're not going to want to answer it, but Congressman, should he run for president in 2020?
Oh, well, I don't know about 2020. I've run in 2 Republican primaries. Talk about lonely. That's the loneliest feeling in the world, running against an incumbent in a primary. I would love.
So you don't think that'll happen for President Trump? He won't be primary?
It may, but I don't think it's going to be Tim Scott. I would love for Tim Scott to run for president, whether it's 2024, whenever it fits his heart. But he has a cheery, optimistic brand of conservatism that I think our country would benefit from. And quite frankly, whether he won or not, our country would be better off hearing someone with his life story. The grandson of a man who couldn't read, picked cotton, and then he grew up to pick out a seat in the United States House of Representatives. That's a story I wish my fellow citizens could hear. Whether he wins, I hope he runs.
Senator?
I'm not even running for my homeowner association's presidency. So at this point, I thank God that I've had the privilege of serving the great people of South Carolina and this great nation. I'm a kid that got a second chance. I almost flunked out of high school as a freshman. My mother worked 16 hours a day to give me a reason to believe in this nation and having a great work ethic. I am blessed already to fulfill a part of the mission that I think the good Lord has sent me to fulfill. And as long as I continue to work hard for the people, whatever the good Lord has next for me, I'm open to it. I've always wanted to be a minister. My mother wanted a pastor, and she got a politician. So I'm still praying and asking God for forgiveness on that one. But the reality of it is that you don't need a title to fulfill a mission. You need to be clear that the mission that you are on is worth the rest of your life. And I feel like spreading the good news of hope and opportunity is worth the investment of the rest of my life. However and wherever I do that, I am committed to that objective. And that's one of the reasons why we wrote the book Unified. It's because I believe that it's in our best interest to be seen as the nation that is still sitting on the hill, drawing more people to look towards us for solutions that they can't find in any other corner of the globe. That's good news.
Senator, Congressman, thank you for your time. a dinner partner now that the congressman's going back to South Carolina?
I'm looking for one. Help? No, sure. We've got a lot of good friends. No one like Trey, but I will learn to survive without him in Washington.
Thank you very much for sharing your story. We'll be right back.